Hi everyone, I'm Miss Lydia from the Boston Library. Thank you so much for joining us for our craft project this Friday. Today we are going to take some old books and make a small display shelf and a sculptural tree to put on it, all out of book materials. So what we're using here are books that have been damaged, that are no longer really all that usable. I have a book that I'm going to be using for my shelf and one that I'm using for pieces. You can make this project entirely out of one book. It's a little easier if you have two books that were both damaged that you can use. So the first thing I'm going to do is prepare my base. And so I have my book. I found approximately the center. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered, but somewhere around the center you want to find a page that you want open. So you can either choose an illustration or you can choose just text, but this is what is going to show on my shelf here. So I have this book, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some glue here, hot glue, and then I'm going to push down both sides to it with a little bit of a curve. You can make this shelf so that it will either hang on the wall flat, like that, or so that it will sit on a table. I'm going to make mine so that it could sit and be propped up like this. And then what we're going to do is use the extra pages to build up a little shelf like this that will sit as your display spot. So, like I said, I'm going to start by gluing these end pages, and then I'm going to use lots and lots of Mod Podge around the edges to kind of hold those pages all together so that once it's propped up, I don't have pages curling in. So I have my hot glue gun here, and we're just going to kind of glue those end pages. Just like that. And it's okay if there's a little curve in it too. It doesn't have to be perfectly flat. And I'll stick that down. And then you can see my other pages are popping up. So that's where my Mod Podge comes in. Open that up. I have my paintbrush, and what I'm going to do is go all the way around. I'm going to start on the longer edges and put a really solid coat of Mod Podge down there. This is just going to kind of seal those edges and keep it from popping up. Remember, it's going to dry clear, so it's okay to get a fair amount on there. If you have a spot that's particularly stubborn, you can use a little hot glue there too to get it to stick down. Your shelf is also going to prop these pages open, so if they don't stay perfectly, that's okay. This is again just to kind of keep them from curling up. Sometimes if it's humid or if you're hanging it in a certain spot, those pages, as they absorb humidity, will start to curl a little bit, and we don't want that. So I've gone across the two longer edges, and then I'm going to go across the top, seal that off. This also makes it a little bit easier to dust too, because then it's a little easier to wipe that dust off of the top. And you can keep going over this too as it dries. It'll get a little bit tackier. You can kind of layer more and more in there so that you get a nice sealed edge. And kind of push it down a little bit too so that it helps it stick. And do the same on the back here too. And then we're going to let that dry. So I'm going to set that aside, and I might, as it's drying, add a few more coats in. So I'm just going to set my Mod Podge and my brush aside. If you don't want your brush getting all sticky, you might need to wash it right away. So for the next section, we're going to use the other book that I have that's already missing some pages. I'm going to use these pages to build a fan-shaped shelf. And so what I'm going to do is cut a straight edge, and then I'm going to loop them just like that. I'm going to do a whole bunch of those, glue them together in a fan, and then glue that whole piece into here, and that's going to be my shelf. So I've got a paper cutter here. You can use scissors. If you're using a paper cutter, be very careful with those edges. And I've ripped out a bunch of sheets, but I know I'm going to need more. So you can take and just rip out a few at a time. You don't have to get a perfectly straight edge either on it. So I'm going to get a good stack of those. Now the shelf, you don't want to be putting anything really heavy on it, but the more pages you add to it, the stronger it'll end up being. So if you only use a few pages to make your fan, it's going to be pretty weak and you might not want to really set much of anything on it. So I have a stack about like that of pages to start with, and what I'm going to do is just cut them straight here so that I have a straight edge to work with. In order to get these all pretty consistent, I'm just going to line up with the edge of my text. If you can see that, so I have the edge of my print is right there, got my pages lined up, and I have a stack like that. So I'm going to go through and do that with the rest of the stack. The next step that I have to figure out is how deep I want my shelf to be. So thinking of my book here, if I put a fan here, I'm going to want mine probably about that depth. So I'm going to kind of eyeball that. You can measure it, of course. You can make them quite a bit narrower, but the narrower you make it, again, the weaker it's going to be. So I'm going to make mine fairly thick, but I do want there to be enough display space above. So I'm just going to kind of lay my papers here, figure that out, and give myself a little mark. And then that's going to be what I'm going to cut all of these to now. So I'm going to take a big stack and cut them all to that width. So I'm going to use this length paper here, and I'm going to make a bunch of shapes like this. So I'm just going to take a piece of paper, a single one, and I'm going to run a line of glue down one edge and then pinch it together. So I have my hot glue, I'll run a line just like that, and then try to line up those edges carefully and pinch it together. And then what you can do as you're going along is you can stack them inside just like that. And we're going to want to put a fair number of them in there. So even though it looks like it's filling up pretty quickly, you want to get some strength, so you're going to want to kind of wedge them in there. Once I have a pretty decent stack of these, I have 9 of them, I'm going to glue them together. So I'm going to take 2 pieces, going to again run a line down one side, and then line them both up and stick them together just like that. And I'm going to glue all 9 pieces like that. And then once that's done, I'll be able to wedge it into my book. In order to keep our shelf level, you want to make sure that you're really carefully lining up those top and bottom edges so that they run parallel all the way across. I finished gluing all 9 pieces together, and I'm going to take that and see if I think that it looks like it's enough. So if I left it with those 9 pieces and I glue that in, that's approximately the size of my shelf. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. There's 2 ways that you can go about this. You can either continue to add more pieces out so that it pushes your book a little further back. So I'm going to start there. You could also build out from there, and you can take your pieces and build another layer out by just sticking them almost in like a honeycomb sort of pattern or beehive, where you're adding another layer onto the outside. So I'm going to start by adding a couple more layers, opening my book a little bit wider with that fan shape. I've added a few more pieces to the width, so I've ended up with a fan that looks like this. And now to add a little bit more depth to my shelf, I'm going to add that second layer. So what I'm going to do is take more of those shapes and just glue them right in. And I don't want them to stick out too far, because again, that's going to weaken your shelf. But what I'm going to do is glue them in approximately that level. So I'm going to try to keep it even all the way around and just glue one in between each of these pieces. I now have my second layer added to it, so you can see it's a lot deeper. And what I'm going to do now is make sure that I can firmly attach that to the rest of my book. So I'm going to really solidly cover these 2 end pages with hot glue and stick that right into the corner. And I'm going to test the strength and try to reinforce it. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of mark off where that edge comes up to in my book. So I have my mark right there, and I'm going to fill that area with lots and lots and lots of hot glue. And then I'm going to work out from that a little bit. And I'm going to take my fan and stick that in, trying to line it up with that bottom corner. And then I'll hold that down. And then I'm going to pick up the one side and add my glue there. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And then you can see what my shelf looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of test the strength of that a little bit. Again, you don't want to put anything real heavy on here, but what I'm going to be displaying on it is going to be very light. So I'm going to just add, if I look at it, I can see like I've got a little bit of space right there. I'm going to fill that in with a little bit more hot glue so that that area is strong and reinforced. And then it can either sit like this on a table, or if you want to add a hanger of any sort, you can add even just if you go through the cloth of the book here. So if you separate that area a little bit from the back on the spine, you could poke a hole in there and run a piece of twine or something around there and hang it on the wall. This is also the time to check and see if any of my pages are coming apart, if I need to put any more Mod Podge. I think they're staying pretty solidly together. There's a little spot in the bottom, but that's not really going to be a problem if I'm setting it on a table. So at this point, the shelf part of it is finished. So you can leave it right at that, and if you have something small that you want to display on your shelf, you can stick it right on there. You could build a little platform too, if it's gonna like fall down through those cracks. You could put a little piece of cardboard there or another piece of paper over top of that. If you Mod Podged a few pieces of paper together, that would give you a little bit more stability there. But at this point, this part of the project is done. So we're gonna set that aside and start on the tree. For the tree, I'm gonna be using pipe cleaners and more paper. So that's why I cut a big stack right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 5 pieces of pipe cleaner, and I'm going to line up my edges, and this is going to be my trunk. So I'm going to come in, they don't have to be perfectly lined up either. I'm going to come in about 1 inch, and I'm going to twist together my trunk. So I'm leaving these bottom pieces, and what I'll do is I'll fold those out like roots. You can use as many pieces as you want. What you want to try to do is create something that's going to be stable enough to balance the rest of your tree. And you can see I have my trunk started, and then I'm just going to continue to twist those together as I go up, and then I will start to fan those out into my branches. And you want them to kind of go every which way so that it looks more like a natural tree. You don't want them to be too straight or too even. So there's the basic tree. Now it can be a little tricky to get it to balance. You're also going to want to trim some of the branches. If you want more branches, use more pipe cleaners. If you need more stability in your base, you need more roots, you're going to just take another pipe cleaner, twist it up through. It's also the easiest way to add another branch. And then I can adjust my roots to wherever I might need them. And then you can see, once I've messed around with that a little bit, I have the beginnings of my tree. Now I want to make sure that I'm making it on the right scale for my bookshelf. So I might set it on there right now to check and see. I'm going to trim my branches a little bit shorter, but the base is pretty close. I might trim a few of the roots just a little bit shorter once I'm done. What I'm going to do now is basically cover everything in paper. So I'm going to take some very small, I'm going to leave the roots exposed so that I can adjust those. I'm going to take very small strips of paper. You can rip or cut them. And then what I'm going to do is Mod Podge them. So I'm just going to take my Mod Podge and wrap these around just like that and cover the entire tree like that. If you find it easier, you can also use a little bit of hot glue as you're adding that first layer and then just cover everything in Mod Podge afterwards. Sometimes it's tricky to get the paper to stick down just using the Mod Podge on that first layer. I finished covering my tree in paper. So I've glued all of the paper onto the pipe cleaners, covered all of it, and then what I have is a small little heart punch that I'm going to use to make some leaves for it. So I have punched out a bunch of little tiny hearts that I'm going to use. You could cut out leaves, leaf shapes if you wanted to. This is just a quick way to do it. You could even punch holes, like circle holes, and use those. So I'm going to go and add my leaves with a little dab of hot glue all over my branches. So I've gone through and added some small leaves to my tree. You can add as many or as few as you like. You don't have to add them at all if you like the way the tree looks without them. You could also vary the size. So if you have a different size punch or you want to cut different size leaves, you could add in those for a little bit of variation. So there's my finished tree. When I combine it with my stand, this is the final product that you get. So you could use different types of paper too. So if you wanted to use a darker paper so that this stands out a little bit more, you could do that. You could use music, you could use map paper, anything that you want to use or have on hand. And then, like I said, you could put a hook on the back of this to hang it from the wall. It is fairly strong, so it'll hold and support, you know, something light like this. And my edges are all glued and dry now. If you have any questions, comment below. I hope you enjoyed this project, and we'll see you again next week.